Hello everyone. I hope the ACT conference is going well, and I really hope I could be with you this time. The fact that I can't is related to the topic of my talk, the fact that people have different identities and that these identities sometimes are in conflict with each other. In my case, my identity as a teacher, we're still in the middle of the term here in Germany, and also my identity as a husband and father who is currently needed at home here in Berlin. We're in my living room actually. Welcome to my home. Those identities are responsible for the fact that I can't be with you, which caused me some considerable amount of deflection actually, because the ACT community is also something that I would regard as my family. So what you can see from this example is that sometimes deflection is unavoidable. Nevertheless, Kim asked me to give a talk about Bayesian affect control theory of self. Now that you've heard from Jesse all about artificial intelligence, probability distributions, etc., we want to see how we can apply these concepts to understand what's going on at the level of the self. My talk is going to have two different parts. The first half, I would like to talk about established things that are already published. I'm going to briefly talk about the affect control theory of self, a study that shows how some of these concepts can be put to work, and introduce you with the core ideas of Bayesian affect control theory of self, which you can all read about in published papers. In the second half, I would like to take the opportunity to get some thoughts out in the world on how we can possibly apply these concepts to understand what's going on currently in the world. So this is a high-level overview of affect control theory. I know that Neil is in the audience, so if I get it all wrong, he can correct me later on, but that's the way I see things, basically. So social interaction on this view is governed by a nested system of feedback loops. At the top level, there's the self-sentiment, which is a location in EPA, affective space, and you could consider as a sort of summary representation of all the social experiences one has had in one's life. And then society provides us with a theory of people, with a set of identities that people can assume in specific situations. And as the theory goes, in order to feel authentic in specific social interactions, people are motivated to pick identities that are relatively close to their self-sentiment. So now you cannot just pick any identity. You have to obey certain institutional constraints. For example, if I decided to become a surgeon because I just felt like it, that would probably be a bad idea for everyone involved. So society has come up with a system of training and certification that one needs to undergo before one can do that. However, within the scope of given institutional constraints, people are assumed to try to act so as to be able to maintain their overall self-sentiment. And the lower part of the feedback loop is just the classical affect control theory story that you're all very well familiar with. So people pick a behavior to match their identity and experience a related emotion, and the emotion is a signal that tells them whether they succeeded in confirming their situational identity at this point. Before I get down to the core business of talking about the Bayesian version of affect control theory of self, I'd like to briefly talk about a study that Jens Amrasat has conducted as part of his dissertation here at the Free University of Berlin, because the study sheds some light on a core issue that classic ACT has struggled a bit to cope with, and that's variation of meanings in society. One prominent theoretical example is the concept of the habitus put out by Pierre Bourdieu in the 1970s, which I guess you could describe as a form of cultural expression of social distinction. So you have basically patterns of social perception and action and self-presentation, values and taste that are tied to one's class position in society. So this is obviously in clear contradiction with the perspective usually advanced by ACT that says, okay, there's this big consensus on the meanings of social concepts, and we all agree on that, and that allows us to maintain meaningful, fluent interactions all the time. So the question of the study was, can we actually find indicators of distinction and social diversity in basic ACT concepts, like people's identities, traits, and settings? So this was a big survey study with about 3,000 German respondents. And in order to subdivide them into different groups that we can associate with different kinds of habitus, a classical survey instrument was used that's quite frequent in German lifestyle research. It's a questionnaire that divides people into different segments called lifestyle groups, and that's based on two dimensions. The one vertical dimension relates to people's perceived living standards, and the second dimension refers to people's modernity versus traditional orientation of their lifestyle. This is something that's also related to a biographical perspective, because much empirical evidence seems to suggest that people become more traditional as they grow older. So it turns out that these lifestyle differences in German society are also systematically related to variation in the overall self-sentiment. So when people were asked to estimate their self-esteem and self-efficacy, which relates to the potency dimension of EPA space, and self-activation across these different groups, we found that self-efficacy varied with the perceived living standard. So if you think I have a higher living standard, you also are more likely to perceive yourself as relatively potent. And the modernity dimension was related to self-activation. So people who have more modern lifestyles reported a higher degree of self-activation on that measure, while people with a more traditional lifestyle reported a lower degree of self-activation. And the E dimension, the self-esteem dimension at the level of the self, is sort of the diagonal through that plane of biographical perspective and living standard. So working class people have reported a lower amount of self-esteem than the modernist people, who are both high on living standard and high on modernity. Now, of course, as you know, anybody who isn't depressed usually has a high self-esteem. So workers in that study had a high self-esteem, and modernists had a very high self-esteem. Now, if you look at the affect control theory of self again, and the idea of a conceptual repertoire of society that speaks in different ways to different selves, then one hypothesis for the study was that the ratings of concepts would show up with a different closeness to the self. And that was indeed true. So for example, if you look at the lifestyle of conventionalists, then religion is important to them. So accordingly, they rated concepts that denote religious identities in religious settings and religious ideas as closer to self relatively to the rest of the sample. And more distant from the self were concepts that are related to left-wing ideas like revolution, strike, and solidarity. And similarly, if you look at the working class lifestyle, it was interesting to see that they had relatively positive attitudes, again, compared to the rest of the sample, to concepts that signal what I would call down-to-earth values, like being a decent or good-natured person. And the same was also true for concepts that relate to family and community, which seem to be of particular importance to the self concepts in that lifestyle. The thing that has always puzzled me about ACT is the strong emphasis on cultural consensus. I mean, on the one hand, it makes sense because how could we ever communicate smoothly with each other if we didn't have that shared universe of symbols? On the other hand, you can see so much division in society that seems to stem from the fact that people have different values and ideologies and just can't seem to get to that consensus. And yet, I could never put that together with the strong empirical findings that basically everyone agrees on every concept in society. So I think by putting this together in an affect control theory of self framework, Jens was able to develop this crucial insights that by looking at the conceptual universe from the point of view of the self, from the affective anchor that the self sentiment provides, all of a sudden this division of values and ideology becomes visible in an ACT framework. The question then is, how do we deal with these variations in our dynamic models of everyday social interaction? And that was a core motivation to develop the Bayesian version of affect control theory. I'm now going to start talking about the Bayes act of self level. In fact, there are three different classes of motivation for the Bayes act of self model. The first reason is very simply, we don't actually have a computational model of affect control theory of self. So we felt that as we transitioned from the classic affect control theory model to the Bayesian version, in order to provide a complete computational implementation of the theory, we also needed to account of the higher level feedback loop that includes ideas on the self. The second motivation is basically everything that was important for coming up with Bayes act in the first place. So basically everything that Jesse told you about this morning. So for the self, as any other social object, we need to be able to model uncertainty. One doesn't really know, maybe in some instances, who one truly is. We need to be able to model dynamic changes and learning and so on. The third reason to require us to have something like the Bayesian affect control theory of self is my great-grandfather. I never met my great-grandfather. He died the year before I was born. But I do have a very clear affective representation of him. My mother, who actually grew up with her grandparents, talked a lot about him. And she described him in the warmest terms as a loving person, a caring person, a respected leader in his community. And in the stories of my family, he definitely was a source of warmth, of love, and inspiration. And yet, I know that he was also a devout Nazi and the warden of a concentration camp. This was not a death camp, and my great-grandfather was never implicated in the Holocaust. This was he served in one of the early concentration camps in the 1930s when the Nazi regime started in Germany, and the camp served as a prison for political opponents in that early stage. So, as far as I know, he was not involved in the worst kind of stuff, but I think from everything I know about this time and those kinds of camps, it is pretty certain that he probably oversaw some very horrible episodes of prisoner abuse. Given my national identity and the historical heritage that every German, even down to my generation, has to bear, and as I just explained to you, that is related to my personal family history, there's a clear litmus test for any social theory for me. I cannot accept any theory of social behavior as valid that can't explain how a fundamentally good person like my great-grandfather was lured into enthusiastically following someone like Adolf Hitler, who, in his quest to make the German Empire great again, brought terror and unprecedented death over a whole continent. And we also have to be able to explain how it was possible
that people who were fundamentally good neighbors and loved family members committed heinous atrocities in different situations.
Now, of course, we want a social theory not just to be able to explain abnormal situations like the rise of fascism in Germany in the 1930s, but also the more mundane, everyday social experiences. So the example that we have in the Bayes Act of Self paper is a little bit more of that everyday nature. So what we described there is an agent that fundamentally has two identities. It's a daughter and also an employer. You see that as the little red dots that are there to represent probability distributions. So the daughter bubble is a bit more on the lower right side of the picture. So a daughter is higher on evaluation than an employer, but a little bit lower on potency. And the other bubble is the daughter part, no, the employer part of that self-representation. Now, as with any model, this is of course an extreme simplification. People don't usually just have two identities. In fact, Dave and Neil in their book estimated that people have something like between 700 and 800 identities. So the way you would have to picture that in the Bayes Act of Self model is that you have a complex landscape in the EPA space of hundreds of hills and valleys, and wherever there's a hill, there's a heightened probability that the person might, in some situation, occupy that location in the space. Now, if you compare any two landscapes in that idea, if you have 700 or 800 different identities, no two landscapes are going to look exactly the same, which is the source, we believe, of our individuality and uniqueness. And so this model, we think, can explain how there can be individual personalities, even though we have a general framework that relies so much on the consensus and on the shared meanings of single identities. So let me go over some key concepts of both Bayesian and classical affect control theory of self. So some of this we had before in the initial figure. So there is the fundamental self-sentiment, which I described as this overall summary representation of one's social experiences. We could also say it's a dispositional aspect of so what one brings into a situation when one interacts with someone else. And we measure this with the item myself as I really am. And in the classic version of affect control theory of self, we consider this fundamental self-sentiment, it's usually good and potent and moderately active, a point in EPA space. And in the Bayesian model, we consider this to be a probability distribution, like the one I just showed you in the daughter-employer example. But then there's the situational self-sentiment, which we could regard as some kind of short-term memory of all the identities one just recently enacted in that situation. And again, we can see this as a point in the deterministic version of affect control theory of self. In fact, it's a weighted average of all the identities that one just recently implemented versus, again, a probability distribution. And the third fundamental concept is that of inauthenticity. And that's comparable to deflection at the level of behavior. That's the difference between the fundamental self-sentiment and the situational self-sentiment. So the key motivational principle is that people strive to align their situational self-sentiment with their fundamental self-sentiment. If they don't manage to do so, for whatever reason, they don't perceive the interaction as authentic, and they strive to create a different interactional experience. Now, mathematically, there's a difference in classical affect control theory. We just take the Euclidean distance between the situational and the fundamental self-sentiment, basically as a measure of inauthenticity. Whereas in the Bayes Act version, we need to compare two different probability distribution. And there's a measure for that, which is established in information theory, which is called the Kullback-Leibler divergence. So I'm going to show you in a minute what that means in simulations and what we can do with that model. But before I do that, I need to talk about something that's a little bit of an open question. So the question is, how do we actually model the situational selves? So there's a straightforward way that can just be mathematically derived from the classic affect control theory of self model. That's an accumulation model. So the idea is that all the identities that somebody has just occupied accumulate. So in a way we compute a weighted average, and that means that divergences in one direction and the other can cancel each other out. So something as opposed as a loving grandfather and a concentration camp warden would actually result in a fairly neutral situational self. The question is whether that's realistic. So a different way of modeling the situational self is what we have called in the paper the noisy OR model. So there the idea is you actually flip a coin. So either the situational self is what it was a moment ago, or the situational self is the identity that's currently required by the situation. And that's a probabilistic decision. And that allows us to have those multimodal distributions. So people can be saints and sinners at the same time.
I want to emphasize this point. So far, Bayes' Act, and by extension Bayes' Act of Self, is largely theoretical and conceptual. Of course, we can inherit a lot of the evidence from ACT, but there are more parameters in Bayes' Act. So we need to do some empirical work in the future to make sure that we don't just get desired results by tweaking parameters, but by validating that they have some actual correspondence to phenomena in the real world.
So here's a description of the simulation, which we have in the Bayes' Act of Self paper, that allows you to understand a little bit what this model allows us to do and how it can enhance simulations of social interactions just based on the lower level of the ACT feedback loop. So the upper left part of the figure you're going to recognize, that's the fundamental self of the daughter-employer agent. And then the other charts show different situational selves. In what we model here in this computational experiments is interactions of the daughter-employer agents with different kinds of people. An employee, which is the complementary identity to the employer, a mother, which is the complementary identity to the daughter, and a stranger, which reinforces neither of the two facets of the daughter-employer's self-sentiment. So now the way the simulation works is we have 20 rounds of interaction with each of the complementary identity with agents that have each one of the complementary identities. And then we let the model anticipate on another round of interaction the amount of inauthenticity that the agent predicts. So let me explain this to you. Let's just imagine the daughter-employer talked to her employee all the time and all the time and all the time. Then this is the cyan picture that you see in the lower left of the figure. So this would result in a collapsed situational probability distribution that, as you can see, if you compare it with the two red dots that represent the fundamental self, that's quite different. So there's a pretty significant divergence, which the daughter-employer will likely feel as an inauthentic interaction. So what can she do to restore her fundamental sense of self? Well, one option that this simulation actually predicts is she could pick up the phone and call her mother in order to restore the other facet, the other identity of her fundamental self, and to bring the situational probability distribution more in line with the fundamental distribution. So the same thing works vice versa if we model a situation where the same agent interacts with a mother agent all the time. Then after 20 time steps, we can see that a future interaction with an employee agent would be perceived as more authentic. So this model sort of pulls the agent back to recreate the original shape of the fundamental self probability distribution. A simpler model of the same principle is the tethered goat model of social interaction. I got this from a very nice paper by Bruce Edmonds, who came up with a simulation model to model the collective decision-making process underlying Brexit. So in this model, interactions are like a tethered goat. So people are free to walk in whatever direction they want, but not too far. Eventually, they are pulled back in the opposite direction.
Those of you who are familiar with Dave's work on group dynamics and modeling them with ACT, in fact, he presented that model at the previous ACT conference in Indiana, but there's also an SPQ paper. You may have noticed a similarity in the fact that we're not only able to pick an action, but the model is also able to select the next interactant.
So the way this works in the group simulator is actually just at the lower level of the two feedback loops. So that's just affect control theory. There's no self. So the idea is that there is a highly structured situation, like a jury that engages in some court deliberations. And every agent is an affect control theory model and has a very firm knowledge of who all the other agents are. And then based on the ACT impression formation equations, at each time step, every agent can model the anticipated future deflection when interacting with any of the other agents. And then the agents pick the interaction that provides the lowest amount of deflection. And by this mechanism, a complex pattern of social communication in this group emerges. However, this group simulator, as impressive as it is, I really loved that paper when it came out and when Dave presented this work. It has some important limitations that we believe we can overcome if we go up at the level of the self and if we use the Bayesian version of modeling it. The first limitation is that in reality, people are not blank slates when they anchor a group interaction. They bring their fundamental selves with them. So some people are clearly more dominant than others by disposition. So the way we viewed group dynamics is more as a constrained satisfaction process between the dispositions that people bring with them and the configuration of the situation. And most groups are also less structured than juries. And with a jury, it's very clear how many there are. They have to be there. It's clear what their roles are. And that's often not the case with groups. So we could deal with this additional uncertainty that surrounds most real groups by having Bayes act of self agents that can also decide at what point they want to join a certain group and how long they want to be in there. At one point they want to say goodbye to the group again. And this is something we plan to do in the near future. Kim and Jesse and May Nagapan from the University of Waterloo and I have been awarded a grant for a project entitled Theoretical and Empirical Modeling of Identity and Self in Collaborative Groups. The grant comes from a program called Digging into Data that seeks to bring together teams of researchers across the Atlantic to use data science and novel computational methods to study social science questions, like group dynamics, for example. And what we want to do in this project is we want to test our ideas on group collaboration and modeling them with the Bayes-Act of Self model, and at the same time test these ideas empirically with observed online group interactions on GitHub. GitHub is a popular platform among open source software developers. So you have virtual teams that come together and work jointly on problems. And we think this allows us to, we hope this allows us to, for the first time, subject our novel ideas surrounding Bayes-Act to comprehensive empirical tests. And at the same time, maybe provide some theoretical enhancement to current inductive data mining approaches in computational social science.
Everything we know about the future seems to suggest that self-organized collaboration of groups, often enabled by technology, will become ever more important. Let me give you an example. Between about September 2015 and March 2016, more than 1 million refugees arrived in Germany, mostly from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq, also some economic migrants from the Balkans. So overnight, there were unprecedented numbers of people that had to be dealt with. And the cities in Germany, for example, the city of Berlin, where I live, just couldn't deal with it. There was not the infrastructure in the administration to provide all of them with housing, and let alone process all the paperwork that is required in a complex bureaucratic state like Germany. But then an amazing thing happened. The citizens of Berlin started to solve the problem themselves, largely without the authorities. So they used tools like Google spreadsheets, communication on social media, GitHub as a platform to program helpful apps, to connect those that were willing to help and donate some items they had, or donate money or their time, willing to house a refugee in their home, with those that needed help. And the problem, at least in an immediate way, it's going to stick around for a while, obviously, but the immediate urgent problem got solved largely without a government bureaucracy. And this kind of self-organization of a society, many people think is going to be a defining feature of the future. Some people have seen it coming all along. I recently came across an interesting article, Educators and the Knowledge Revolution, that was written in 1981 I was 2 years old by the time, by a certain David Heiss, professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill.
Let me quote, "Electronic devices for storing and applying knowledge are an imminent product of science, not of science fiction. Artificial intelligence research has progressed enough to enable storing knowledge bases and letting a layman access them. Book-sized knowledge devices with all the capabilities mentioned will appear in 15 to 25 years. End of quote. So 15 to 25 years, that would be between 1996 and 2006.
Sorry, Dave, you got it all wrong. The iPhone came only out in 2007.
So whether the timing of predictions is always right or wrong, that's a difficult matter, of course. But it's not very difficult sometimes to see the patterns. And what the pattern seems to suggest is that we're in the middle of a revolution of our communication technology. And as it happens, changes in the communication technology have often been related to the form of social organization over the history of humanity. So if we take a very, very big picture view of human history, Then they just dug out some new bones in Morocco that seem to suggest that we're, as a species, Homo sapiens, were about 300,000 years old, not 200,000 as we previously thought, until 3 weeks ago or so. So most of these 300,000 years, we have lived in little tribes and villages, roughly the size of 150, which you know about as Dunbar's number, and which is about the natural size for human groups. And that all happened in hunting and gathering societies. And the main communication technology was oral language at the time. Then about 6,000 years ago, which is really about nothing in the history of humanity, people lived in cities. And that coincided with the development of a novel communication technology, writing. Writing was important to sustain the city life because you needed to store some things that exceeded the capacity of biological human memories, like who owns what amount of cattle to whom and stuff like that. And then many thousand years, we skip over some things. So let's say nothing really important happened until printing was developed, the next big revolution in communication technology. And that allowed people to spread ideas very, very rapidly in comparison to everything that had been possible previously. And that set off the development of the Industrial Revolution and the nation state as a form of social organization. And what we're currently seeing is the internet and the digital communication technologies that rely on it that allow us to communicate over the globe almost in real time. Kim and I chickened out a little bit when we planned this presentation, so we pre-recorded this because we still have little issues like Wi-Fi's that don't work and stuff, and we didn't want the presentation to be disrupted by that. But that's a very temporary problem. It's going to be solved very soon. And what we can essentially do is have real-time communication, and not even the Atlantic Ocean that's currently between us can stop us. So that's a really significant change that is going on in the world right now.
In the remainder of my talk, I would like to be a little bit more speculative. As probably many of you, I have spent a lot of time recently thinking about the things that are going on in the world right now. I think many of these events are related to that very global transition to a planetary society enabled by digital communication that many people see emerge. But we also see very clear and potentially dangerous patterns of resistance against those developments. And I would like to share some thoughts with you, not very mature thoughts maybe, but perhaps some interesting ones as to how we can use the tools that we have, especially Bayes-Act and the Bayes-Act theory of self, to understand these developments a little bit better.
So if we have a very rough look at the psychology of change, I think it can be summarized in one idea. People dislike change. They don't like it. So there's a huge amount of management literature and organizational psychology literature that talks about the necessity to overcome resistance to change. If you talk to consultants, they will tell you that 70 or 80% of all change projects they ever do fail. So that's adaptation to changes in the environment is a very big issue for organizations. If you look a little bit deeper, so what's behind it? Why is it so difficult? Why do people dislike change? I think one important source to look at is terror management theory. That's an experimentally very well supported theory in psychology that looks at what thinking about one's death and about one's mortality does with one's ideological system. And what we can learn from that literature is that the more you get people into thinking and musing about their own mortality, the more rigid they become cognitively, And the stronger is their endorsement of conservative ideology. And conservative ideology is just in many ways another way of saying they become resistant to change. So what's really behind of this? One really interesting paper that I only recently discovered, although it's actually clearly related to the ideas that we have been developing in Bayes Act and Bayes Act of Self, is the idea of psychological entropy. I'm not sure if Jesse has explained the concept of entropy in this presentation of Bayes Act, but it's just a general property of complex systems that relates to I guess we could say, the amount of uncertainty that is in a system. The origins are from thermodynamics and information theory. And in this paper, they have related it to the decision problem that the brain has. There is an incoming flux of perception, and then the brain needs to map these perceptions to a certain course of action. So if you look at the x1, x2, x3, x4 in the two graphs that you can see, those are different options for action. And you can have more or less certainty as to what kind of action to take. And a low entropy situation is one where it's very clear, and the probability of one action to be the right one is very clearly visible. Whereas in a high entropy distributions, all the different actions are equally likely to lead to the success that you desire. And now what we know, so that's what the brain constantly does. It monitors the environment for dangers and for opportunities to fulfill one's goals, like eating or reproduction. And neuroscientists know there is this network of neurons which is called the behavior inhibition system that basically interrupts everything that people are doing when there is a situation of high uncertainty. Then people are alert, then cognitive resources kick in that allow people to make decisions as to what is needed at that point. And this is extremely stressful. So this is essentially a high state of deflection. And this is related physiologically to noradrenaline. So, and this is a neuroscientific paper mostly, but what's interesting is their take on ideologies and narratives. What do modern humans in the modern world that don't live in the Stone Age, what do they do to cope with high entropy situations? They create narratives and ideologies that allow us to select the right answer very quickly, so as to avoid these situations of high uncertainty that are very, very stressful.
So now that we had this very brief look at the psychology of change and why people might resist the change towards a planetary society, from an ACT point of view, we have to ask ourselves, what is it that's changing? And I think it's the theory of people. It's meanings of identities that change. I've always been puzzled by people who oppose gay marriage. They would often say they want to defend families. And this has astonished me, because how is my family in danger because two gay guys decide to marry? It's not. At least I thought. But if we take our own theory seriously, there is maybe something in danger, and that's the meaning of a marriage. Maybe it changes, and we don't know how it changes, whether it gets more positive or more negative or more powerful or less powerful. We don't really know, but that is precisely the point.
So when meanings change, regardless which direction, that increases psychological entropy and uncertainty and tonic stress that people have. So, and a lot of concepts change these days very rapidly. So it's not just the meaning of a marriage that changes when guys are allowed to marry each other. It's also the meaning of a coal miner in the age of climate change. It's also the meaning of a Syrian refugee when they're all of a sudden in my kid's gym at the school. This this truly happened. My kids didn't have phys ed lessons for the better part of the school year because their gym was needed as a refugee shelter. So then those concepts have a very different meaning rather than I see something about the refugee crisis on television. So we don't know how these meanings change, if things get better or worse, but that is the fact that they change and that we don't know what they mean pose precisely the problem for many people, I believe. And if you remember the study that I showed initially, where we showed that different social concepts have a different self-relevance for different kinds of people, then that also, what that means is that some concepts change more quickly than others, and those are more important in terms of the closeness to the self sentiment to some parts of society than to other parts. So if we think of certain lifestyle groups in society and the meanings that are really important to them, they get shifted around by those developments in society. That would lead to a constant situation of psychological entropy where people are not where it's not possible for people anymore to maintain their sense of authenticity in their everyday social interactions. And incidentally, I don't know if this is related or not, but what we do know is that we have seen a constant upward trend in the rise of anxiety disorders and depression in society. And maybe this has something to do with the fact that people have so many situations where they just don't feel authentic anymore.
For me, a concept that changed considerably over the course of political events is Angela Merkel, the German chancellor. She's actually the head of the Conservative Party in Germany. I've always considered myself a social democrat, a left-wing, and I've never in my life voted conservative. Now, with the things that are going on in the world, she's suddenly the good politician. And we have an upcoming federal election this year, and for the first time in my life, I've started myself wondering, well, should I vote for the Conservative Party this year? This is all very confusing.
So let me briefly summarize these first ideas. As I said, it's not a thought-through theory, but the first ideas of how we could possibly use the Bayes Act of Self theory to understand ideological developments that we have seen in many parts of the world. So, first idea, the theory of people in general saves individuals from existential experiences of uncertainty because they can experience authentic interactions in their daily lives. And when we have big societal transitions, like the current one driven by global environmental problems and the development of technology, theories of people change inevitably, and that leads to many people experiencing more and more inauthenticity. And if we take seriously the work on psychological entropy and terror management and the implications for the endorsement of certain political ideologies, then that would predict that those changes in the theory of people make people more receptive to totalitarianism, and they want to return to an old, rigid social order that they think allows them to be authentic once again. And the fourth idea is, if we look at Jens's work about the habitus, then these processes probably do apply to some groups of society more than others.
The most contested item in political discourse these days is truth. If you ask people across countries who have voted for nationalist parties and candidates in elections, one survey item explains best why they did it. It's, they tell it like it is. And as a scientist, that's puzzling. How can you say that people who delete data on climate change from public accessibility and who are so hostile to science, how can it be that those people tell it like it is? But on second thought, if I think about it in ACT terms and in terms of the theory of people and in terms of Bayesian and uncertainty, I think what people mean is that these leaders show by the way they are behaving, they act in accordance with a deeply felt theory of people, how the social order should be like. And I think the big challenge ahead of us, if we want the planetary society to work, and if we want to enable humanity to solve global problems like climate change and migration in a sustainable manner, we need to come up with theories of people that work and that make people feel authentic and restore a sense of self-actualization that so many have lost. So at this point, I would like to thank you for listening to me. We're hoping that the technology will enable us to have some live Q&A in a moment. Thanks and bye.